So today we are going to talk about keeping your code clean with service objects. And in particularly, we're going to be focusing on Rails and how to extract the logic out of controllers and models to keep them readable and slim. As John said, my name is Marcus. I am the CTO of DateBox. I've been programming in Rails and Ruby for a little over 10 years now. So I feel like it is really something that is a fantastic language to learn. Ruby's amazing, Rails is great, but it does have its pitfalls and actually promotes maybe some bad design, and was kind of the thought process behind today's talk. So hopefully I'll cover some of the pitfalls that you'll see. As John said, work at DateBox, CTO. The company is focused on relationships. We're a subscription company, so each month we send out date night in a box to couples. Typically, they focus on tasks and events and games. We have an escape room, we have a donut making, we have breakfast in bed, indoor camp out, just to name a few. We've shipped a little over 250,000 dates in the past 3 years since we've been in business, so that's pretty awesome. We're super excited, especially since it's Valentine's Day and we get to, this is our holiday, this is it, this is Christmas, this is Super Bowl for us, so I'm really glad to be here, and very relevant that John stole my joke to talk about why I got chose on today. Thanks, John. Skipping those notes. Funny thing about Valentine's Day is actually a DateBox holiday, so I'm off today. But also, what this actually does is it builds up a little pressure with the spouse to like go all out for Valentine's Day, because I have the day off, so I get time to think of something awesome. I work at a relationship company, so it's what I'm supposed to do. However, inside knowledge, I had to prep for a talk, so I got out of a lot of it. So thank you all. But seriously though, if there are any poor fools out there who have not thought about Valentine's Day, I have some mugs here to kick off your gift. Anybody want them? You need them? Here you go. I know you are doing all out, man. Don't act like you haven't done everything. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, we're going to talk about keeping your code clean with service objects. Maybe more aptly named, how to give up on fat models and skinny controllers. We've all heard that. It's been mantra preached since day one. We lived it. We hate it. We're tired of it. How do you even do it half the time? You put stuff in models. You put it in controllers. I don't know about you, but I just ended up with bloated models. I've ended up saying, how can I shove this out of a controller into a model? How many callbacks can I use? How can I manipulate the data in the model? My controller looks great, but my model is terrible. It's over 300 lines in a good day. I have no idea what's going on. It references and has dependencies on mailers, other models. It's a mess. So what's going to help us bring all that in? Service objects. Okay, so how many of you have heard about service objects or the service object pattern? Awesome, fantastic. So what is a service object? I want to kick off and state inheritance from nothing, so I think that's important. If you've been in the Rails ecosystem, a lot of things inherit from something, ActiveRecord based in particular. It's a plain old Ruby object. We've heard that. What does that mean? We'll talk a little bit about that. It's really just a class with a specific purpose that performs an action or service. Here's the thing about service objects. You don't need gems. You don't need to learn a new DSL. You pretty much have all the knowledge you need just to get started. You just need to take that leap and give it a shot. So here's a very simple service object. Lives in app services, starts with a verb, accept, invite, does one thing, that's it. Again, this is very simplified. Accepts an invite, sends a mailer out. Again, going back to that not coupling mailers and models together, just a little taste of what we'll see. We won't go into this too detailed. You'll see this several times over. So again, when to use a service object. We kind of talked about what they are. We want to see what to do. When your action reaches across multiple models, when an action interacts with an external service, when there are multiple ways of performing the same action. Again, if you're dealing with an e-commerce solution, you make a purchase, it deals with shipments, it deals with line items, inventory. That might be a good use case for a service object. You're making a blog post and you need it to go out to Twitter, you need it to go to another service. Service object will help you decouple that logic and keep it in one place. So I thought about how to best demonstrate service objects, and I went over it a few times in my head. And I think for me, what's best is just to tell you lessons learned, lessons that I have ran into, mistakes I've made, mistakes I'm still living through today. We do have a code base that's over 3 years old now, and we all know what that means. A lot of it is really bad and poor designed, and I have to live with a lot of it. And every day I think about these lessons, and so we're going to talk about them. And you can all help make fun of me if you want. A service object should do only one thing. It should do that one thing well. It should do that one thing clear and be concise in the one thing it does. That's simple, but a lot harder to achieve in reality. A lot of times we will write the code and it does 4 or 5 different things and we think it's fantastic. We're just glad we solved the problem. But we should really step back and evaluate, is this object doing its job and how well? So again, referencing back the service object I showed earlier. Again, it performs one action. It holds the business logic to perform that action. Again, very simple, clean. Here's how you use the service object inside of a controller. Again, very, very slimmed down example, but accept invite, call it. If something success, redirect, else, alert. Very simple use case. Have as little public methods as possible. Again, you want to do one thing, and you want to do one thing well. And a lot of times, we tend to have multiple public methods. In this instance, the service object could call accept an invite, notify about the invite, respond to a failed invite. There are multiple things it could do, so we need to do the one thing. Here's an example of maybe how I would have tackled a service object at first. I would have had a user service. I would have had a method to create the user. I would have had a method to update the user. I would have had a method to delete the user. Again, this is all in one file, and I would have felt great. I would have high-fived myself and said, all of the logic is here. I am great. People know where to look for it. I don't know if that is true. Instead, I encourage you to try this. What this is 3 different service objects: the create service, the update service, and the delete service. Again, these are 3 different files with 3 different actions to do 3 specific things. They should respond to the call method. Now, this is not a maybe universally accepted standard, but I feel like it's a pretty good practice. I highly recommend it. And so again, going back to the accept invite, there's one method, the call. I at one time actually started using verbs, and I would do things like accept invite dot accept, and then that gets a little verbose and hard to read as you start having multiple service objects. But not only that, like I think a lot of people get into Ruby because it's easy to read and easy to understand, and why would we complicate things with our poor naming conventions? And again, I don't think it's bad, but for me, as I'm reading my own code, it made it really easy to go away from using verbs. I still have service objects today that respond the same way, and it's just because I don't want to change it. It does too much right now. You can also do perform. You can do run. You can do execute. Those are some other options. Sidekick, another well-known library, uses perform. I felt that I didn't want to confuse anybody with using perform and maybe mislabeling what people think it is just based on their normal convention. Also, I believe that lambda procs respond to .call, so it feels a little more like you're writing Ruby. It's helpful to return something useful, maybe an object. The default sometimes can be maybe return true or false. I executed this action, so did it succeed or did it fail? I advise you to maybe go against that because there are way more useful things you can do with a service object than just knowing if something succeeded or failed. There are multiple ways to go about this. Typically you may have 3 possible outcomes. The action succeeded, the action failed but in an expected way, and maybe a race condition on why it failed. Here is an example of a service object we have. Great. Subscription start service. So if you didn't know, that actually returns a subscription object. And it will return if that subscription object has any errors, if it's successful. And we can do that just by knowing this object return, or this service object return the subscription object itself. And again, if there are any errors or any success messages, they're going to be assigned, and you can manipulate the subscription just like you could in any controller in any way. It allows some flexibility. If you were to use this maybe in another service object, you can then check if it succeeded. If you were to use it in a controller, you have your flash message of succeeded just based upon the error messages that are assigned to the model. Naming and namespacing. I find it very nice to look at my service objects and know what my app does. I can look and see everything to do with queues is inside of this folder. Everything to do with subscriptions is inside of this folder. Everything to do with orders is inside of this folder. So namespacing is one way to achieve that. Start off with, in case you haven't got it yet, app services is where your directory for services will go. Feel free, again, to group them by external services, high-level features, or actions. We utilize a service called EasyPost, and all of our EasyPost interactions are namespaced under EasyPost. It allows us to know anytime we're dealing with EasyPost, we can directly access it inside of that service object. Again, if we have a file inside of app services invite accept, it will define invite accept. And the same way for create. I do want to make a note. We actually decided to append underscore service to all of our service objects when we started this pattern. For better or for worse, we've stuck to it. What that does mean is now we have things like app services invite accept underscore service.rb. Maybe a little too verbose, but again, I'm sticking to it and I don't want to refactor everything, so we'll see how that plays out. Again, I briefly touched over this, but the service pattern allows you to see what application does at a glance. This is a very narrow tree view of what ours looks like. I tried to show enough without going 4 slides deep. So again, we have app services, auth order. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to take a drink of water while you all read them. So as you can see, subscription, there's a cancel service, there's an extend service, there's an invoice service, there's a pause, a resubscribe, and there's a start. By looking at this, we know all of the actions to deal with the subscription that our application does. These are all the ways that either a user or an admin or even the application itself deals with the subscription. It's nice because if you're onboarding somebody, you can say, we stick to this quite well, and if you look at this, you're going to have a good understanding of what our application does. Now, we understand that there's going to be some logic in controllers, there's going to be some logic in models. We use other patterns, form object patterns, query object patterns. They follow very similar structures, but for the most part, we can say, look inside of this directory, and this is what our application does. As a side benefit, you don't actually need to go crawl around ActiveRecord callbacks to check, oh, but I created a user. What about the mailer that is sent? I'm going to go on a little side tangent. This really doesn't have to do with service objects as much, but can we stop using ActiveRecord callbacks? Again, not specific, but just something that I just maybe too passionate about carrying. Again, let's look at this. Side tangent, I know, sorry. Very simple model. after you create a user, let's send them a welcome email. You've seen this in tutorials. You've probably done it yourself. You're probably wondering, is that wrong? And I'm not going to say it's wrong, but I can't stand up here and say it's right either. Because do we know what we just did? We created a dependency on user and user mailer. Anytime a user signs up, they're going to get a welcome email. What happens if an admin needs to create a user? And maybe that user doesn't need a welcome email. Maybe that user reached out through customer support, had an account before, lost it, it got deleted, and they want to reactivate it again. It seems very small, but poor customer service for them to get the same email, maybe the same invoice, maybe the same whatever that is multiple times. And so just thinking through that and easily achieving that by maybe not using ActiveRecord callbacks. Because we're talking about service objects, let me show you how a way to solve this would be. Again, user, create services. We have a call, create the user, hits another private method in this service object, sends a user mailer. Now, this may be the service object we use for the front end, and maybe for admin, we have an admin users create service. Okay? So just a way to step away. I figured I'd tie it back in so my rant wasn't without any use. When possible, wrap methods and transactions. And what I mean by this is you have access to ActiveRecord-based transaction. And so here we are creating an easy post shipment. And then on the success of creating that easy post shipment, we are updating our shipment with the data that was returned. What happens if their API is down? Well, in this instance, we have validations on the rate, and we have validations if that easy post data exists, it will error out, it'll roll back and step back, and it will never be like the shipment was updated. Okay? In this instance, we have this open struct to turn a success in a shipment, but that's for our particular use case. In here, it isn't always needed, but I actually wanted to show you how you can return a success message if it isn't necessarily dependent on the shipment. In this instance, when we're rolling back, there may not have been anything wrong with the model. The validation may not have kicked in. And so in this instance, we're just defining a success, true or false, so that way we can handle it inside of another service object or controller. Who doesn't like to hear this? Testing becomes easier. I mean, everybody does TDD, right? Hardcore, all of us. Yes, love to hear it. I don't. I'm gonna admit it right now. So I actually really like this. And let me show you a test. This is an actual test in our application. This is it. We pause service. We call the pause service, and we just test the expected outcome. Okay, it does one thing. It pauses the subscription. So no dependencies, no need to check other things, no need to see if the user got a message saying success, no need to do anything else. We did the one thing, we're testing the one thing. I don't know if you know this, but that test runs pretty fast. There's not a dependency on anything else. Now, what I'm not saying is we don't have integration tests to maybe test the action of the user pushing the button that caused this, but what we do know is that this is tested and the expected outcome of the pause service does what it should do. And so anytime we're pausing a subscription on the site, we use that. Again, one thing, test one thing, that's it. I've never actually done this, so take this with a grain of salt. And doing my research to make sure I kind of knew what I was talking about, I saw a lot of people do this, and I was like, that looks kind of cool. So create a helper module, so you don't have to call the call over in the new and pass in args, just to extend active support concern. Throw this in support, our services, support, services, concerns, whatever makes you happy. And here's that example at the beginning, just utilizing that. It looks a little bit bigger, but I actually filled it out a little bit more than maybe before to give you a little deeper insight. Again, we don't actually do this. We end up just typing .new.call all the time. Another way to do this is actually create a generator. Inside of Rails, they allow you to create your own custom generators. So that way, anytime you generate a service, you can have it populate .new and .call for you. Wow, I talked really fast. Really fast. Somebody should have threw something at me. I mean, I clocked this way longer than this before, I promise. What's up, John?
So where do you draw the line between what goes in an ActiveRecord model and what should be in the service?
So go ahead. Oh, yes, thank you. So where do I draw the line between what goes in a service object or an ActiveRecord model? I think it depends. I think a lot of that comes in designing of the application and starting off knowing what your end goal is with the feature and really planning out what does this do and what interactions do I have. There's a lot of times when I keep the models just as dumb as anything else. A model knows relationships. It maybe knows a few other things. And then most of the time, I try to find other places as a service object. Again, we use form objects, query objects, and all these are just patterns that they really just allow you to use object-oriented programming in a way that maybe feels best for you. I don't want to say is right because what is right? And so I think for me, where I draw the line is if it's an action and I am doing something and manipulating that piece of data and it maybe touches something else, or maybe I'm redoing that same thing multiple times and I always want the behavior to be expected the same each time. I think that's where I start with that and kind of go from there. Again, I find myself actually not even using ActiveRecord base as much as possible. I will create what I like to call headless models. There may be a better name for it, which is basically just a class that doesn't extend from ActiveRecord that really just does everything very similar, but maybe has a query object that queries shipments in such a way that I want to use them differently. Maybe these are, we use the term boxless shipment a lot, and that's basically meaning a date has not been assigned to you as a user. And so that is an example of how I would use that headless ActiveRecord class. I know I kind of went off sideways, but yes, he's following up.
So I've seen the service pattern before. Can you talk about how you set up your query objects?
Yeah. So he asked, previously seen service object patterns, but asked about query object patterns. Correct? So the rules I like to follow are, it should start off by passing in a relation, okay? So the relation should be something like shipment.all, okay? And then you should then pass in any arguments that manipulate that relation. So in an instance, maybe you pass in scopes, maybe you pass in dates. That's very, very common, okay? And then all you do is, again, in this instance, app queries, boxless shipments. I'm going to reference that again because we do a lot with that. And then we'll say the relationship is shipment.all. We'll pass in a time. In this instance, we focus on a time, a date, and a year. So anything February of 2019. And then all the logic with that, whether that is scopes, whether that is SQL calls, we encapsulate that logic inside of that query object. So whenever we know we have this crazy SQL query that joins shipments and users in the time of year, and that doesn't seem that crazy, but maybe just crazy because of the way it's been designed. Anyways, and that logic, we know that really if you're writing SQL statements, don't put them anywhere else outside of a query object. And that's because whenever somebody else needs to use that query object, we want them to expect the data in the same way that anybody else would expect it. And it allows clean communication throughout the team in such a way that I don't have to tell a team member, oh, when you query shipments, note there's this one weird thing in this exception because when we very first started the company, we didn't use dates. And so now they know, oh, if I just reference that query object, it knows the date thing that did or did not happen, did happen. But does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you approach service objects calling other service objects? Do you try to avoid that, or have any advice on that?
I mean, if you're going to embrace it, just go for it. How do you, something about referencing service objects within service objects. Is that a good pattern? Is that something you do? Is that good? And I jokingly said, embrace it. Typically, we reference service objects in a way that we may have a factory if we're going to reference multiple service objects. Again, I'm just throwing out names here on things. People call them all kinds of things. I may just have, going back to that, maybe the headless object. It may reference the multiple service objects, or a lot of times we do that in jobs. And so I would say we stick away from having service objects reference other service objects unless it has a cute other name to do the thing that you're speaking of. For instance, factories. It's object or we can make any name and say it. You only reference multiple service objects in this directory. So I think just choosing what's right for you and your company is maybe the start. And again, I just encourage, like, if you haven't tried it, just try it. Nobody's happy with the programs after a year, right? We all look at our code a year later and say, what was I thinking? This may be 3 weeks later. I can't guarantee it won't be. But just try it. I don't think there's anything wrong with referencing service objects and other service objects as long as it's clear. Yes, sir?
With how you name the files and structured them before, I imagine those wouldn't fit in the real asset pipeline or automatically close them for you. Does that mean you have that's an assumption? If so, does that mean you have to require each service object?
In the past, it has not.
Again,
I'm going to get at this one day. Does adding services folder in asset pipeline load the files for the application by default? It hasn't in the past. I believe it does now in Rails 5 and plus. I say that because I was able to remove the code I had in place to load it, and it still worked. So try it. I find removing code is good because you reduce the file size of things, but also if it still works, like high five and walk away and don't think about it. Don't take that advice. Try it, test it, push it to a staging site and make sure it works. But that's what I did. Bad advice, I'm sorry.
Have you found any good patterns for error handling? Good ways, bad ways?
Have I found any good patterns for error handling, good ways or bad ways? Lots of bad ways, which is not to do it. I'm being serious. Like, a lot of times we forget that, like, we're building software for humans, and humans are error prone, and a lot of times we think everything is right from the beginning. I'm being serious. A lot of times I forget it. We have service objects that handle different types of errors, whether we're dealing with like maybe an API error, or we should expect a model error, or we should expect maybe something that's more user-based error, and those maybe output and massage the messages a little bit prettier. So yes, we do have service objects that inherit from whatever ActiveRecord error message or whatever you're dealing with at that time, and a lot of times we just roll our own because we want to massage them in a way that is nicer. And I don't know if you remember on that one slide I had, the open struct, that in practice in the application would actually be like error service .new, and we pass in a success and we pass in an object. And then return an error object. Again, service objects should return something meaningful like an object to stray away from the true or false default that I think we have. And again, I'm talking about me. I don't know, anybody else may not be the same way, but for me, I want to go true or false. Did this thing happen? And it kind of forces us to follow that. Here's an object. Here's a Boolean that you want because things are pretty, right? Success question mark makes us feel good. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Perfect. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Is there such a thing as a service that's so small that you might as well just live as an ActiveRecord?
Is there such thing as a service object that's so small that it might as well live in ActiveRecord? Yes, I have tons of them. But I start there now because applications grow, and I want to make sure that planning ahead, I at least have a place that I can default put it. For instance, a lot of those service objects maybe just update timestamps. And that's all it does. But again, if you're going kind of in that pattern, you might as well go all in and try it. And then you'll find that on the backside of it, kind of that freedom to go and change code. And when you start to refactor, maybe you do that more often because you're not afraid of updating your quote unquote God model, right? It's so big that I just put it there, I just put it there, I just put it there. This kind of negates that and helps you move away from that pattern, if that helps answer your question.
What kind of bothers me about it is, like, I feel like, for me, if I did it this way, it would be almost going too far. Because as soon as I open up the service directory, I'm going to see 100 files. And that, to me, is bloat. And I'd rather see something that's nicely written and concise.
So to,
Even though it might be 300 lines of code, that bothers me less than seeing 300 files with
To-
one line of code.
to repeat, going too far and having the problem of having 300 files inside of app services versus your already model you have in models that already exist.
I mean, it's just a
Yeah,
perspective.
it's
One guy is another person's organization.
absolutely. And I think a lot of it is buy-in of maybe the team as well. When you're doing something yourself, it's a lot easier just to do whatever you want and move forward, which is kind of some of the problems, honestly, we lie with DateBox today is, at the beginning, it was me. And I think it's important to get your team's buy-in. I think it's very important to present this and talk about the pros and cons, because for me personally, it's easier to talk about things if they're action-based versus models, because sometimes things get very confusing. And when I'm talking to a teammate, I can refer to things as actions. And so even though they know it's on the model and could easily live on the model, by referring to actions, I can have a human interaction and not feel like I'm talking programming. And it's a very like niche thing that happens. And so I think there are bigger benefits outside of file structure or file size, or maybe things feeling unorganized because now you introduced a whole new dependency inside of your application of services. So again, I think a lot of it is just agreeing on things with your team, and making sure everybody's on the same page and listing pros and cons. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but okay.
I think it's important to talk about that.
Yeah. I think that's undervalued maybe, and maybe I'm wrong on that, but just agreeance and buy-in from your team on communication, and not just, as a CTO, at times it feels like if I just say, sometimes it feels like people just take that as an action, and a lot of times it's like, no, this is discussion. Like, I want everybody to buy in on this, or I'm not doing my job to ensuring that developer happiness is a thing. And which, again, some of this is pre-existing, and we update as much as possible and refactor it. Any other questions? Thank you all. I appreciate it.